maybe as far back as 100,000 years ago, were the first storytellers based upon multiple lines of evidence. But this is consistent with the Native American point of view as well, that storytelling is what makes us human. Um, and so I think it's a very simple idea. Stories are behind my earlier idea about Cahokia as a ritual, a theater state. There are stories that give all those rituals meaning, right? Storytelling is itself a ritual, but storytelling also gives meaning to all the rituals that we do.
From the river to the valley to the sea. All the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 72 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I've been lucky to travel around the world and visit some really amazing places. Some sites where thousands of people once thrived in diverse, complicated, complex communities. Places like Tikal, Angkor Wat, Machu Picchu. I'm sure places that you have all heard of. Maybe many of you have visited as well. These are places that offer us a window into the past that leave us wondering what happened to the people who lived in those places, who built those structures, leave us wondering what happened to those communities. I live in St. Louis. I am just across the river from another one of those places, Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site, also a World Heritage Site now, I believe. I firmly believe if the Mississippian communities who thrived at what we now call Cahokia had built out of stone instead of dirt, Cahokia would be as world famous as those other places I just mentioned. And I was surprised to find out when I was looking over previous podcast episodes that I had never done an episode on Cahokia. So we're going to fix that in today's episode. I had a chance to talk with Dr. Julie Zimmerman, who has considerable expertise on the history of the site we call Cahokia, and has a particular emphasis on how Cahokia thrived as a place of storytelling, that it was stories that attracted people there to begin with, and that's what explains its incredible growth. So in this interview, we cover some of the basics. We talk about how Cahokia went from a fairly quiet late woodland era community to this thriving metropolis with thousands of people that virtually appeared overnight. We talk about some of the people who moved in, the immigrants who formed the backbone of the communities in Cahokia. We talk about their connections to other people across North America, their relationships from what we can tell of those with people across the continent. And then we get into talking about those stories and how storytelling might explain the way people were drawn into this community, and thousands and thousands of people eventually moved in. We talk about Cahokia's eventual decline, and Julie speculates on what she thinks some of the factors were that might explain how this massive city eventually gradually depopulated. And we finish by talking about the role of contemporary Native American communities in interpreting the site and helping to manage and protect this incredible place. If you've never visited Cahokia Mounds, I highly recommend going. I find it can be a little challenging to fully appreciate what went on there just by walking around the grounds. My first time I thought, well, it's a bunch of hills and some grass. It was really hard for me to imagine the complexity and the scope of what previously occurred on that site. I found it helpful to do an audio tour. The visitor center has been closed for a while for complete overhaul. That is supposed to be reopening again this spring. If they offer audio tours again, I highly recommend doing that. There are some terrific books about the Cahokia as well, and in the show notes, I'll put the names of a couple of those. But you could just Google Cahokia Mounds in your favorite bookstore, and I'm sure you'll come up with lots of good options. That would really help to get a framework to understand just how amazing this place was. So I hope you enjoy. I think it's a good discussion. I really enjoyed talking with Julie, and I really got lost imagining the possibilities of a community built by storytelling. Thanks to those of you who continue to show me some love through Patreon. You keep this podcast alive. I'm deeply grateful for your support. So if you want to join this community, you can join the Patreon community for as little as $1 a month. Go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. Patreon's not your thing? You can buy me a coffee. I drink plenty of coffee. I always appreciate those of you who are willing to help feed my caffeine habit. Go to MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, and there you'll find instructions on how to buy me a coffee, or a few coffees if you're feeling particularly generous. At that same place, MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, you'll find links to all previous 71 episodes, as well as how to access the show notes for each of those episodes. Click on one of those episodes, you'll find the show notes. And I often post photos to accompany each of those posts for the podcast as well, so you can enjoy that. And now, on to the interview. Dr. Julie Zimmerman is professor of anthropology at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. She's an archaeologist by training, with a deep interest in the Native American history of Western Illinois, particularly the area we call the American Bottom, that wide, flat expanse of Mississippi River floodplain in Illinois that runs from Alton to Chester. While she specializes in the archaeology of animal remains, she is also very interested in understanding how Cahokia grew into such a large and consequential city. Welcome to the podcast, Julie.
Thanks for having me, Dean.
Anything else you'd like to tell us about your background? Like, how did you get interested in archaeology and anthropology?
I grew up in Barnhart, Missouri, south of St. Louis, and I actually had a Mississippi River view from my bedroom window as a child. I could see Illinois, and we never crossed the river. And I honestly, my mom liked to take us to cemeteries, so I had, and we collected fossils. We lived next to a limestone quarry, so I had an interest in the past, but I never heard of Cahokia till I went to college. So
Wow.
crazy, huh?
What was your path school-wise then to get your training?
I won a scholarship to Washington University, full ride, and back in the day, they printed off paper catalogs telling you what all the classes were, and I didn't get very far because anthropology was the first thing in the catalog, and I said, "Wow, that is everything I've ever wanted to do, all right here in one place: cultural anthropology, biological, archaeology." So it all came together there, and yeah, so I went in knowing that that's what I wanted to do because it's all fun stuff all the time.
What was the first research project you got to work on?
Probably, I'm gonna say a ceramic analysis. I did a little field school over in Bridgeton, and I afterwards I worked on the ceramics from the site. About that same time, I also took my first course in human osteology, and then I took my first course in zooarchaeology, the archaeology of animal bones. And I'm gonna tell you, humans are just one of many animals, so archaeology really, yeah, lots of different animals to look at. But I in my excavation, since I've been teaching at SAUE for Gulp 25 plus years now, all the excavations I've directed, the bone preservation is terrible, so we don't have any animal bones to look at. So I have all this other stuff I have to look at instead.
Wow. I imagine we could have a very long conversation just kind of going over some of the methods and how what the work is like, and maybe
Yep.
some other time we'll do that. But I'm really curious to know like how you went from this interest in animal bones and studying animal bones to having your imagination captured by Cahokia.
Well, I mean, we are 20 minutes or in Edwardsville from the largest archaeological site north of Mexico. And there's nothing else like Cahokia north of Mexico. It's just by any measure possible. There's nothing else like it. So it's hard not to be interested in Cahokia when you live so close to it. And I think, I hadn't done, when I first started teaching at SIUE, they asked me if I wanted to direct my archaeology field school at Cahokia. And I was like, no, no, I want to work on endangered sites. And I think Cahokia should be protected. We shouldn't be digging at Cahokia, certainly not with students who are having their first excavation experience. But, teaching about Cahokia and thinking about, what it is to be a human in general. Really, as you know, I wrote an article about Cahokia as a theater state about 15 years ago. And, I came up with the idea while teaching and talking about cultural anthropology. There's cultural anthropologist Clifford Gertz who put out the theater state model, which basically says that states um, grow not by armies, by force, coercion, but by attracting people to them through their theatrical rituals and their pageantry. And so I thought that was a good way to explain Cahokia because, some archaeologists were acting like it was just another chiefdom. But I mean, the next largest so-called, what we call Mississippian time period, which is about it starts earliest at Cahokia. Earliest is the biggest and the earliest of the what we call Mississippian centers. And so Cahokia has its so-called Big Bang about 80, 1050, becomes a big city about that point. And the next largest site is down in Moundville, Alabama, and the entire site of Moundville would fit in the Grand Plaza of Cahokia. So again, when I say there's nothing else like it, I mean it's just on a scale it's just, so there were other archaeologists saying it's just another chiefdom. And just a couple archaeologists had been brave enough to say it was a state. But I think they were going back to the old idea of a state. Yes, there's a bureaucracy there. But I don't think that and there were warriors at Cahokia, but I don't think they were spreading by force and by, use of an army. So that's what led me
Before
to
we
the
get
idea.
too deep into the theater state part of it, let's kind of cover some of the basics too. Is that
Yep.
I don't know how familiar some of my listeners are with even the general history of Cahokia itself. One of the things that amazed me when I really started getting into this and when I went to the visitor center across the river for the first time was how much we actually know about it. Like we
Mhm.
know quite a bit about this settlement, and there's a lot we don't know, obviously, too. But tell us a little bit about how Cahokia got started and what it evolved into in a fairly short period of time.
Okay, I'm going to first say one part of the reason we know so much about Cahokia is, of course, our attention is attracted to it because it is such a big and important site, but also all the highway work that has happened with the construction of 255 and 5570 went right past Monk's Mound in the 1960s, but the law was just passed at that time requiring archaeology to be done. And then when 255 was built, starting in the 1970s, the law was firmly in place then, and there were, dozens of excavations on sites up and down 255, and then since then all the feeder highways and other projects going on. So as a result of all that, what we call cultural resource management work, we know more about Cahokia and more about the American Bottom than just about anywhere else in the world, seriously. The area is first occupied by Native Americans. We know there could be Native Americans here earlier, but the first we're absolutely sure about are showing up at the end of the last ice age. So, for your listeners who've been to Mastodon State Historic Site, that's a site that's in use at the end of the last ice age where people are hunting mastodons there. That's pretty unusual to hunt mastodons. Actually, there's very little evidence for that. But all those sites from what we call Paleo-Indian period at the end of the last ice age are all up on the bluffs. Because you can imagine the floodplain at that point is a big icy torrent, glaciers coming through, flood waters coming through, and it's cold. Um, so there isn't a whole lot of crossing that river at this point. There's very like this the stone that they're using we call chert that they're using on the Illinois side of the river at that time is different than the chert on the Missouri side of the river. So they're not crossing the river. It's probably not a very safe thing to do.
Hmm.
Um, Cahokia itself, the first occupation that we know about goes back to about 4,000 years ago, what we call late Archaic period. And by this point, it's a modern climate, and these backwater lakes have formed in the American bottom. Like Horseshoe Lake is the last one left today. The rest were drained in the 1800s. So these backwater lakes have formed in the American bottom and in the lower Illinois Valley. And there are small settlements of people living longer term around them, and there's very importantly they are saving the seed. There are a number of different native plants that they start saving the seed from and planting it in the spring, and as a result of that they are domesticating plants going back to 4,000 years ago. And the earliest domesticates are squash. So if you like acorn squash or zucchini, they're descended from squashes that were domesticated right here 4,000 years ago. Sunflower. If you have ever tried quinoa, quinoa comes from the Andes, but we have a local species here of the same genus, Quinopodium berlandieri, also called goosefoot. So they've domesticated those and another plant called marsh elder or sumpweed. So 4,000 years ago, they've domesticated at least four different native plants. And by around AD 800, which is the next occupation we see at Cahokia, what we call late woodland period, they have about 12 different native plants that they're growing in their gardens. Okay, so around AD 800 at Cahokia, we see a small, I feel comfortable calling it a farming village, but there are dozens of villages like this in the American bottom. There's nothing special at this time about the one at Cahokia. And they've just got the bow and arrow. So I always tell my students if I could live in any time period of Illinois in the past, it would have been late woodland period because they got plenty of venison to eat. They have these snug little houses. They would dig a big hole in the ground. The houses are pretty small. It might be a little bit bigger than a king size bed because all they're doing in there is sleeping. But you would step down into this snug little house, and they had domestic dogs, and they had their gardens, and it looks like a pretty nice time to live. Okay, so there's
Well,
this
plus plenty of fish to eat too from the
plenty of
rivers and all
fish,
the lakes.
absolutely. They're
Right.
again, they're living around those backwater lakes, but they're also, sites that are closer to the river. We see they're fishing big river fish as well. So yes, I always joke that the paleoethnobotany, looking at the plant remains, is actually a lot more interesting than looking at the animal bones because it's kind of like with the animal bones, it's deer and fish, fish and deer, fish and deer, fish and deer, fish and yeah. So they're eating a lot of fish. Um,
Well, I guess
really
part of
different
the
things.
point of that is that they didn't have to go far to find food. Like probably they
Absolutely.
lived in an area where food was plentiful and didn't require a huge amount of work for them to find then.
Absolutely, very rich place to live, as it is today. It's a very, great fertile natural resources. So, around AD 900, corn comes in, maize, we should more properly call it. And corn is coming from Mexico. And there's no evidence of Mexicans arriving at that time, but we have this plant that's probably being passed from sister to sister. I should mention that women did the farm work among the Native Americans. The Europeans were horrified by this, to see women out working in the fields. But they were the gatherers of plants, and then they became the tenders of the farm fields. And the men, when they got maize, when they got corn, it was quite common in Native American societies for the men to help prepare the cornfield, but then women did most of the rest of the work in the farm fields. And I'm sure when corn comes in, again, passed sister to sister from village to village, and and the technology to the know-how to grow it and to process it and to what how you should best eat it. And I'm sure stories were coming with that too, and not just stories about how to grow it, but myths about when I use the word myth, I don't mean that to mean untrue stories. I mean to the Bible's a myth according to anthropological terminology. So these are stories about how corn and the cosmology, how they came to be. So corn arrives here about AD 900, and this is a warm, wet period. And anyone who has noticed all the corn and soybeans grown around here knows that corn loves heat and humidity. So this is a great period for growing corn. And Cahokia happens to be at just about the widest spot in the American bottom floodplain. It's about 12 or 15 miles wide there, and it's really good dirt for growing corn in that area. Archaeologists have looked at the different soil types, and the soil type that it was growing there was really good for growing corn. And so by AD, so again, it's about AD 900 that maize comes to the area, and by AD 1000, the village that there is there at Cahokia is noticeably bigger now than other villages that you see in the American bottom. And it already appears to be some kind of a central place, not the capital or something like that, but it's a noticeably bigger village. Um, and looking at the different pottery styles from this time period, it looks like there are already immigrants showing up into the American bottom. And one theory comes from my colleagues Kelly and Jim Brown, is that feasting is very important, and that it really lends to why Cahokia is so important. That they can really throw on the big feast because they have such good, fertile soils that they can have an agricultural surplus to feed people. But for whatever reason, and I'm going to argue that there are other reasons, but immigrants start coming in to Cahokia probably by, like I said, by AD 1000. And by AD 1050, the so-called Big Bang at Cahokia, when Cahokia seems to be the big city, uh, immigrants keep coming. And even as Cahokia is losing population after AD 1200, immigrants keep coming. And we know that from the pottery styles, and we also know it from the skeletal analysis of human bones that has been done looking at the isotopes in those bones. We know they're coming from elsewhere. And it looks like up to 33% of the people are immigrants. So immigrants are absolutely critical to building Cahokia. And imagine, they're bringing all their different ideas and beliefs, and it's a very exciting place to live. And it also looks interestingly like they're coming as children, based upon, knowing, like looking at the growth of the bone and the teeth of the bone and relative to the isotopes, it looks like they're coming as children, which is really interesting. Um, so, sh- yeah.
Tell me a little bit then about what. So you use the word state a couple of times. I tend to fall back on city. I don't really know what word to use to describe Cahokia because there also are like different settlements and there are different communities within this area we call Cahokia. Can you kind of just give me like an overview of the different neighborhoods or parts of the Cahokia and when they developed and did they have different flavors?
Yeah, there are something like 120 mounds. Let's just look at mounds for a second. There's something like 120 mounds at Cahokia. There were like 45, and maybe half of those are left now, right? Most of them, a lot of them have been destroyed. And there were something like 45 mounds at East St. Louis. And across the river, there were something like another 25 mounds. So really, archaeologists are seeing those now as basically one big site, okay? Stretching from the bluff just east of Cahokia all the way west to the river and across to the St. Louis site. And we don't know a lot, and something, so that's something like 200 mounds between those three sites, what is often called Greater Cahokia. There's something like 500 mounds from this time period in the St. Louis area. So again, there's just generally speaking, this is, there's nothing else like this north of Mexico. Okay, so think about, once upon a time they thought East St. Louis site was, we don't know much about St. Louis because so much of it was destroyed in the 1800s. But once upon a time they thought East St. Louis may have been like a competing chiefdom. And there's a mound, a site down called the Pulcher site that's not too far from Dupont, Illinois, not too far from the Jefferson Barracks Bridge. And there are like over 20 mounds at the Pulcher site. Up at in Granite City, Illinois, there's the Mitchell site, which also had I don't remember off the top of my head how many mounds at the Mitchell site. So those were also multi-mound sites. And at one point, the model was that these were all competing chiefdoms. And people compete with each other. Like we could look at the administration of of any let's say the United States or and see competition between politicians, right? So yes, I'm sure there was some competition, but it wasn't like they were equal on equal footing. The big, the leaders are definitely living at Cahokia. And in my mind, and I think the recent excavations at East St. Louis kind of support this. I see Cahokia itself as kind of like the religious and ritual center, and in East St. Louis, kind of like the economic hub, because it's right on the river. And across the site, this river, since we don't know much about St. Louis, I could just speculate that you know, I mean, it's just important to have that anchor across the river. Okay. Um, so, um, and then and bear in mind that economics are not separated from politics and are not separated from rituals. This is all, these are, we talk about separation of church and state, but it isn't real. We aren't, it isn't really separate, is it? And certainly in a more traditional society, there's no effort to try to divide those things up. So the leaders would have been leaders in all those different areas. Um,
So,
so, good.
so I'm just thinking, like, in a modern city now, we have division of labor. So you can go, to a cobbler to get your shoe fixed. You can go to the baker to get bread. Do we think there that kind of division of labor in Cahokia too, do you think? Or
Yeah, I'm gonna say number one. I mean, we know not that long ago in our own history, right, that 90% of people were farmers. Okay, so probably the most important thing is to grow food, to feed these people, and so there are lots of little sites that have, well, there are lots of villages that have a single mound, and there are lots of small sites that have no mounds, and then there are what we call farmsteads. It could be like a single house that looks like it's out in the middle of nowhere. For example, on the SIUE campus, where we've been excavating for since 2009, I was originally interested in the site there that goes back to 2,000 years ago, but there's all this Cahokian stuff on top of it from 1,000 years ago, and so we've found several Mississippian period houses there, but I don't I, my in my model they're not necessarily all occupied at the same time. It could be one big farm family living there growing food, and they're right on Cahokia Creek. They can fill their canoes up with corn and send it on down the creek to Cahokia. So there are all these feeder sites, literally feeder sites, people who I'm sure consider themselves Cahokians because they have the same material culture. That they're not elites, but they do have access to some elite goods. And so they are, I'm sure they consider themselves Cahokians. They're filling up their canoes, sending the food on down to Cahokia. So, yeah, other specialties would include, I know you had asked me previously about weaving. And so, textiles are not going to be preserved very, very rarely. The Janie B. Good site is a site on the periphery of East St. Louis, which is really more what we call terminal late woodland into emergent Mississippian. And they had incredible preservation there, but just little tiny snippets of textiles preserved. So usually textiles don't preserve. And so how we know that they did have textiles is that you see the fabric impressions on pottery sometimes, depending upon the pottery style, but also what we call spindle whorls are for making the twinage, making the cordage. And so like taking a one ply string and turning it into two, three-ply string. And so what a spindle whorl looks like, it's a little circular disc with a hole through the middle of it so you can bind the twine through there and spin it. And sometimes they're made that way, or sometimes it's just a broken piece of pottery that has a hole drilled in it. So yeah, there are particular concentrations of those at certain parts of Cahokia and also at other villages up, in the American Bottom and the uplands above that suggest, Susan Alta suggested that there are specialized weavers in those areas. I'm sure any woman needed to know how to make clothes, right? But if you have a specialized weaver who's making like the finest textiles that the elites wear, I can see like not I can sew a button on, but I cannot make a quilt. Okay. So, we all have our different levels of skills. So, one thing Tim Pawcattat has talked about is was it looks like these different ethnic groups come in, they're coming in with their different pottery styles, and it looks like some specialize then in different pottery styles. So there are probably, again, any woman needs to know how to make her own pot and repair her own pot, but there are probably particular types of pottery that are being made by specialists, certainly some of the fancy, ritual wares. Um, Another example would be stone tool manufacture. I can make an arrowhead. Honestly, it's not that hard, but I could not make a beautiful Cahokia point. So any man or woman needs to know how to make their own basic toolkit, but there are probably specialists who are making the really fancy, beautiful points. And the clearest example of specialists, I mean, for example, we know the clearest example is looking at what we're going to call artwork that Native Americans would not have called artwork. They would have seen them as living beings, but you've like non-human entities that like these works of art they're making are alive and they have their own spirit. Um, and so, for example, one of the artworks we know being made at Cahokia are made out of a stone we call red flint clay. It's a soft red stone that's it's easy, I should say, easy to carve. It's not easy for me to carve, but there's such incredible artistry looking at that work that it's pretty clear that there are a handful of artists who are making those red flint clay figures. And some of them are small statues that are up to about 9 or inches or at max maybe a foot in height. Some of them, like I think the tallest is about the size of your, or sorry, the shortest is about the size of your thumb. Um, but some of them have been made into pipes. Some of them were made to be pipes. But the work, the artwork, the present there, it clearly indicates that not everybody is, it's probably a sacred material that not everybody even has access to. So there's clearly a handful of artists, maybe somebody running a workshop that, teaches the art in their style. So that's a very clear example of specialization. And I'm sure the same is true with whether they're making copper work out of artwork out of copper or jewelry out of shell. I'm sure there's specialists there too. For example, there's marine shell conchs. It's actually I think the lightning whelk coming from like probably around Florida, and they're making necklaces that we call gorgets. They're like a big disc that you would wear like on your chest, but they're also making beads. And looking at where the artifacts are, not a whole lot of those the gorges are found at Cahokia. Um, but the beads are, and we find there are particular little stone drill bits that are needed to make those beads, and there are accumulations of them in particular neighborhoods at Cahokia. So it looks like there are specialists in making the shell beads. I'm There's also supposed to be a copper workshop uh, near Monk's Mound, I think Mound 34. And there's evidence of copper working in East St. Louis in the Red Flint Clay workshops in East St. Louis. So they're definitely artisans. And I'm sure there were specialists in ritual knowledge. Not everybody, think about our priests today. Not everybody knows the whole Bible and all the supporting documents that go with it. So there would have been specialists in that priestly knowledge, and we know that is true of later Native American societies. I'm sure there were, if we want to think about them as scholars, people who understood um, the skies and nature and etc. And I'm going to argue very strongly, I'm sure there were specialized storytellers, even though we don't have direct evidence of that per se.
Right. So you mentioned copper and seashells, and I know they're non-native stones. I mean, all of that speaks to how wide their connections were across the continent, really, right? I don't know that it's necessarily unique to Cahokia, but to me, at times, it was kind of mind-blowing to realize how extensive trading was across the continent. I'm assuming probably by rivers, most likely, or
Probably rivers, but there also would have been had to have been some overland trails too. So the copper is coming mostly from the Great Lakes. And like I said, the marine shell is coming from Florida. And we associate we know the flint clay, red flint clay is coming from this area because this is the source for it. It's actually west of Cahokia, some distance, like 50 miles or something like that. I don't know what it is. And so we can't always tell by the if they're getting their materials from elsewhere and then they're making stuff and it leaves here, how do we know that it's made at Cahokia? We also look at the art style, and there's some debate over that. For sure we can't prove 100%, but we assume that, and I believe that the what we call the Braden style, and I don't remember why they call it the Braden style, but there's a particular art style. It's very realistic in a much I'm no artist, but I want to say when you look at some of the art coming from other sites, it's not to the caliber of realism that you see coming out of Cahokia. So yeah, we see the Cahokian artwork traveling as well. Early on, we see evidence of colonies going to the north, places like Wisconsin, and we see Mississippian stuff all the way as far north as Cahokian stuff, as far north as Red Wing, Minnesota. Later, we see colonies to the south, down the Mississippi, all the way down to the coast. Sorry, the Gulf. That was Gulf and coast together makes coast. Uh, the probably biggest partner to Cahokia, a very special relationship, is Spiro, Oklahoma, which is some 500 miles to the west. Um, and then again, there's they call this the Braden Corridor. Later, it looks like people leaving Cahokia going down into the southeast. So yeah, there are connections um, for hundreds of miles.
Hey, Dean Klinkenberg here, interrupting myself. Just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that is set in places along the Mississippi. My newest book, The Wild Mississippi, goes deep into the world of Old Man River. Learn about the varied and complex ecosystems supported by the Mississippi, the plant and animal life that depends on them, and where you can go to experience it all. Find any of these wherever books are sold. So you mentioned immigrants. Where were people coming from, and what do we know about the traditions or what they brought with them?
My storytelling hypothesis is that it's storytelling that makes us human. And if you think about it, like, the way you see your world is all a story that you've been taught from your parents and the people around you. And storytelling is so absolutely critical. That is the number one thing that separates us from, hey, look, as an anthropologist, I would tell you the great apes can learn sign language, and they can tell you what they need, and they can tell you their hopes for the future. They lie. They make up new words. They're very creative, but what they can't do is get the grammar right, and they cannot which means you can't really tell full-fledged stories if you don't have grammar. And they also obviously cannot articulate words. So it looks like humans going back, maybe as far back as 100,000 years ago, were the first storytellers based upon multiple lines of evidence. But this is consistent with the Native American point of view as well, that storytelling is what makes us human. Um, and so I think it's a very simple idea. Stories are behind my earlier idea about Cahokia as a ritual, a theater state. There are stories that give all those rituals meaning, right? Storytelling is itself a ritual, but storytelling also gives meaning to all the rituals that we do. Um, so it might sound, I don't know, simplistic to say that there's one really good storyteller. I think it's more complicated than that. Like I said, I think there's a lot going on with all the stuff that Kokia has to you know, to go for it. But ultimately, if people weren't telling a good story, those immigrants wouldn't have been coming here. And as Cahokians leave and they go out, sometimes they're, they're going out proselytizing as, like the Trempealeau, Wisconsin. Looks like it's a kind of a shrine site that Cahokians set up even before the so-called Big Bang of Cahokia. It looks like they're doing this before AD 1050. And they're taking these stories with them, and they're convincing the local people up here that this is a good idea. Um, and as later they set up other kinds of colonies, they're taking those stories with them. So wherever you see those Cahokian artifacts, those are representing Cahokian stories that gave meaning to those artifacts.
So, what do you think the basic story was that attracted people? And feel free to speculate.
Well, I mean, I doubt there was one basic story, but what we can clearly see is that there are male stories and there are female stories. Okay. And let's start with the female stories because the Cahokian artifacts that show female imagery tend to stay closer to Cahokia. They're in the American Bottom, they're in the Illinois River Valley, they're down to the Boot Heel of Missouri, down that there's the farthest south is one found down in Arkansas. But they tend to be generally closer to home. So those we call those goddess stories, and there are analogies made with later known Native American goddesses who were the stories were told to anthropologists, 100 years ago about, for example, the Hidatsa had their heroine goddess was named we remember as Old Woman Who Never Dies. And it's a pretty awesome thing where every morning she could go to this creek and bathe in it and become young again. So,
Mm. Wow.
so I know, right?
Where's that creek?
I know I joke people they're trying to sell this on my Facebook feed all the time. Thank you for laughing. Um, so she's associated with plants, right? She's associated as she's a gardener. She is associated with bringing spring. She's also associated with snakes. And the it does look like, for example, the one Cahokian artifact, the goddess has a her hoe going into the back of this snake lake. It's not just a snake; it's clearly a creature with different attributes to it. It has like serpent teeth and has round eyes, and the tail goes up her back and turns into a gourd vine. So it's not just a regular old snake, but she is the Cahokian female figures often showed these women with plants. They often show them with snakes. In the Hidatsa story, the goddess is actually married to a snake. And I like to say again, who isn't? Who wasn't? But she does protect him from other creatures who are trying to come after him. It's a good relationship. And if you think about, well, what do snakes have to do with these other themes? What does a snake do every spring? And it emerges from its hiding place, it sheds its skin, and life begins again, right? It's renewal. Okay.
Mhm.
So there are clear female themes that are about renewal,
Kind of the
bringing
life
back to
cycle,
life.
kind of.
Exactly, the life cycle. Um, there are not from a Cahokian style, but from their local styles down in Cumberland Valley of Tennessee. Robert Sharp, archaeologist, has written about. There are very clear depictions of old woman who never dies down there. He talks about how sometimes you see her with the hunchback, like the little old lady, and other times not. But you tend to find those goddess figurine. They were clay pots down there, and they tend to find them in graves of children. So imagine if you're a woman who's lost her baby and you believe in this goddess who tells you that your baby's going to have life again in a different place. So that would be really important in giving women, of someone to look up to and someone to have faith in, have a character like that. Um, so, and I would add there that, I talked about the different artisans. I would add there that my colleague Gail Fritz and Natalie Mueller from Washington University, both paleontologists, have written about this quite a bit, and they think women were making those at Cahokia, where women were making those goddess figurines there. So I'm sure there were women storytellers telling her story to other women. All right. So then we also have the male figurines. The male figurines are found over a much bigger area. So, for example, um, there are more of the male figurines found at the Spiro site in Oklahoma, again, some 500 miles away, than anywhere else. Okay. And so the male figures have clear themes. They are warriors. You can clearly see they're warriors. You can clearly see they're athletes. They're playing a game that we call chunky. So and we know it's called chunky because well, Native Americans called it chunky. They were still playing it in the southeast and up to the upper Midwest. I don't know what the full extent, but they were still playing chunky when Europeans showed up. So you roll this stone disc. There are different versions, but one common version was you roll a stone disc and you throw a spear where it's going to land. So we know Cahokians were playing chunky. We find the chunky stones, but we also see depictions of the chunky players in the red flint clay figures. We see it in the gorgets. They're clearly playing chunky. Okay, so the men to the ideal man, the heroic man is a warrior. Um, He's an athlete. And then, yes, I will take it back to the character known as Redhorn, who was also a healer. Okay, so 100 years ago, the story was told by Winnebago, more properly known as Ho Chunk Indians, to an anthropologist. And in the story, there are these 10 brothers, and the youngest of the 10 brothers is named Hugh Gets Hit with Deer Lungs, which sounds like a really terrible name, but let's come back to that thought. You want me to tell the story real quick?
Yeah, yeah, go
It's
for
a
it.
pretty engaging story. Okay,
Yeah,
so at the beginning of the
absolutely.
story, this is the youngest of the 10 brothers. Hugh gets hit with deer lungs, and we don't know where the parents are, but the older brothers are always going out hunting, and they're like, sorry, little brother, you got to stay home. And so as the story opens, there's this race, and the winner of the race is going to get to marry the chief's daughter. And once again, the brothers say to their little brother, hey, little brother, sorry, you're too young. You got to stay home. And so, as soon as the older brothers leave, the little brother sneaks out of the house and he enters the race and he turns into an arrow and he shoots around the world. And that's how he's able to win the race through magic. Okay, so now he has the right to marry the chief's daughter, but he's like, oh no, I'm too young. We don't know how young he is. He's could be 7. My guess is he's probably more like 17 or something. But we don't know how young he is. But he says, I'm too young. I can't marry her. And he gives the right to brother number 9. And he's like, oh, I can't marry her. I'm too young. And he gives the right to brother number 8. And it goes on up the line till they get to the oldest brother, who is the only other brother that has a name. His name is Kunu. So it's a respectful thing to honor the older brother, right? So he marries the chief's daughter and he brings her home. And now she's living with these guys, which I'm sorry to, I don't mean to be disrespectful. It sounds like a nightmare to me. But now she's living with these 10 brothers. And once again, the older brothers are going out hunting and they say, "Hey, little brother, sorry, you're too young. You got to stay home." And you're like, "What? He won the race. Like, how why are they still treating him like this?" So they go out and they kill a deer. They bring it home. The chief's daughter, she's a chief's daughter, but she still has to work. She's butchering that deer. She takes out those deer lungs and she throws them at little brother and they hit him. And all the other brothers stand up and they say, what did you do that for? And she says, well, you do it. And they say, no, we don't. We just call him that. So he gets hit with deer lungs, got hit with the deer lungs. So it seems like it's very insulting kind of name when she literally throws the deer lungs at him. At the same time, you know deer are very fast runners. And so this guy's an athlete. He did win the race. He used magic, but surely he's been hit with deer lungs. He's a fast runner, right? But at this point in the story, little brother stands up and he says, from now on, you will no longer call me that. From now on, you will call me the name given to me by the heavens above. And suddenly he says, my name is Redhorn. And he's got this big shock of red hair that comes out of his forehead. And he says, the other name given to me by the heavens above is he who wears human heads as earrings. And suddenly he's got these little human head earrings that are alive. They wiggle their eyebrows, stick out their tongues. And so, so he's got he becomes, this is just the first chapter in an epic tale. And it goes on something like, Radin wrote down something like, the art anthropologist, sorry, wrote down something like 12 chapters. But we know he ends it with saying, and there's more, but it's like, Superman, there's always a new issue that can come out. There's always a new movie that can be made, right? You can always tell another story and add on to it. So he goes on, he's already a great athlete. He goes on to become a great warrior. He goes on to become a healer. He's like Superman and Jesus all rolled up into one. He's like, he's a hero. And so we can clearly see, obviously, over 1,000 years from the time Kokians were telling their stories to the time this story was recorded by an anthropologist told by the Ho-Chunk, the story would have changed. For example, the Ho-Chunk telling the story, their athlete, he shows himself to be a ball player. Well, the Kokians weren't playing balls, they were playing chunky. All right, so the story would have changed through the centuries. But clearly they're telling some version of that story at Cahokia because you clearly see the characters with the human head earrings. You see them wearing these hair pieces that look like deer. They call it the bilobate arrow, where it looks like an arrow coming out of the guy's hairpiece with two lungs on either side of it. You see the one of the figures had the character the heroes commonly have like these front little forelocks, but the one is very clear. The one red flake figure is very clearly has the big red braid coming out of his forehead, wearing the human head earrings. So they're telling a story of a great hero who wore human head earrings, who was clearly from the depictions an athlete and a warrior. And there's also at least one depiction that makes him look like he's a healer as well. Um, so, um, so yeah, I think that is the central story of a hero that is, and think about how women are having, goddesses are so important to giving them, hope for life eternal. The same thing with this character Redhorn in the Ho Chunk version of the story. He dies at the end, then he comes back to life. So his sons are like hero twins who bring him back to life. So
So they have their
like
own resurrection story, huh?
yeah, it gives you the hope, right? If you see your loved ones die, whether baby dies at birth or your son dies off in a battle or your daughter dies giving birth, you always have the hope that they're gonna come back around again.
Hmm. Wow. So you think, yeah, that's the essence that's the essence of the stories that would really draw people in, is it provided those messages about renewal and hope and basically, eternal life in a sense that um, do you suppose the prime, I don't know what term to use, but like the primary civic or religious leader, would that person have tried to claim some connection to Red Horn or?
I strongly suspect, obviously, I cannot know this or prove it, but I strongly suspect that there was an actual hero named Redhorn or whatever in their native tongue. And just like people can debate whether or not Jesus was really the Son of God, historians accept that there actually was a real Jesus. There was a historical Jesus. And so I think there was an historical Redhorn, and I think his legend grew, his stories grew, and there are, this is what a hero does. As you add episodes, you just add to the legend of Redhorn, where you just keep adding stories. But I suspect there was a real hero at the beginning. And in the literature theories about storytelling around the world, they suggest, old world scholars have suggested that the heroic epic as a form of storytelling originates in early states where they're trying to inspire warriors to go out and fight for their city, for their state, and and I think that's probably what is happening at Cahokia as well. I think they've independently invented the heroic epic here as they're telling these stories about this great hero. So that's a very important means for how they're spreading this theater state.
Well, that was one of the things that I was wondering about, is like how much of this story is something that seemed to have emerged from Cahokia versus how much of it was rooted in, cosmology or beliefs that might have been around, circulating around North America for a while before anyway. And I'm sure
Um,
this is speculation again, but that's okay.
Yeah, so if you look at the Middle Woodland Hopewell art is an earlier mound building culture, 1,000 years earlier, fabulous works of art. the works of art are not showing goddesses and heroes. They're showing cosmological creatures. So, for example, a common Native American origin story about how the world is created is the beginning of the world is a water world. And this woman, Sky Woman in the Seneca version of the story, comes falling from the sky and she needs a place to live. And so the little creatures go down, the animals go down one by one, trying to find earth for her. And it's typically the fourth animal that's successful because four is a sacred number. And so in a common version of the story, it's little muskrat comes up. And, not necessarily the biggest, strongest animal, but, little muskrat comes up and he's got this little fistful of earth and slaps it on the back of the turtle and falls back into the water dead. And that is why to this day the turtle has those marks on its back. And also that is why this is Turtle Island. So now Sky Woman has a place to live. She's living on Turtle Island. Okay. So when you look at the artwork from 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years from Cahokia, it's all these what we call earth divers, all the different kinds of animals that would have played a role in this, or birds, which are associated in Native American cosmology with the upper world, or some of these creepy creatures that are associated with the lower world. So that it's all about animal art 2,000 years ago. It's all about the storytelling, about the creation story. Think of it like the Old Testament. We're all telling the book of Genesis. Okay.
Hmm.
And then it's a very huge shift in the art styles. It coming out of Cahokia. The emphasis they still have art that shows animals. I didn't get into that because it's kind of old school. But yeah, there are still some of these earth divers, shown in some of the artwork. Birds are common, but all of a sudden, a whole new genre of the goddesses and the heroes. So the stories may have been around earlier, but they've taken on a new purpose, and they're being used, I think, again, to attract people and motivate people in a way that they weren't before.
So give us a sense of what this, I know this is almost total speculation, but I want you to just kind of run with the way you've kind of imagined it in your head, how these stories might actually be told in person then. Monk's Mound is it was the tallest pre-Columbian structure in North America. There are lots of other mounds. Some of them are just platform mounds built to hold the structure or maybe a show. Others have bodies in them. What would this theater state actually look like if you were a person there?
Well, I'm sure on those flat top platform mounds, like Monk's Mound, I'm sure there were people standing up there telling stories. And in fact, you may have noticed near the interpretive center, there's this little greenhouse there near the Twin Mounds at Cahokia. That's been the home for decades of one of the park employees. But I know the guy who lived there for decades, and he said when he's standing in his yard, he can hear people talking on Monk's Mound clear as a bell. And so the plaza, the Grand Plaza, is all artificially level. Later, after AD 1200, there would have been walls around it that would have obstructed your view beyond the plaza. But I'm sure it was built with acoustics in mind. So who's ever up there is talking, he or she can be heard. And other platform mounds also would have been places where people could stand up and tell stories. So the you mentioned mounds with bodies. Those are the conical mounds typically that have were used for burial mounds. The flat top mounds were typically mounds for it could have an elite house or a temple on it, or again, storytelling could be happening up there. But those are common Mississippian mound types throughout the southeastern United States. But at Cahokia, there's another type of mound we call the ridgetop mound that would have looked kind of like a long loaf, like with a roof, gabled roof on it, or something like that, maybe. But Tim Pocketot has suggested we don't know a lot about them except for Mound 72 at Cahokia, which was excavated circa 1970 for several years. They would never allow this today. Archaeologists, I want to be clear, do not dig mounds anymore. Okay, but back in the 70s, it was legal, and we didn't have the ethical sensibilities that we have now about disturbing other people's graves. So there were excavations done at Mound 72 at Cahokia in the 1970s. The other ridgetop mounds that were excavated. They seem to be like marker mounds for Cahokia, coming like marking the kind of the perimeters of the site, but the most sacred part of the site. But they were torn down mostly, in the late 1800s, and the salvage work that was done early 1900s, the salvage work that was done, Tim Pocketot has written about it, looks like they were built in stages, and they were stages. So it looks like they would have some kind of dramatic theatrical ritual taking place on a stage. At the end of it, people would die, and they would, some of us might call that human sacrifice, but at the end of it, people would die and they would get buried on that level, that stage, and covered over. And sometime, in the future, I don't know how far down the road, next year, a couple years or whatever, they'd come back and they'd do it again. There would be some kind of theatrical rituals taking place on that stage, and at the end of it, people would get buried on the stage and covered over again. And this would take place through time. And so I'm sure that they were up there telling stories. Tim Octot talks about, theatrical pageantry, but what's a play? A play is a story acted out. All right. But also there would have been storytelling. For example, there's a site a few miles from Cahokia that was found when they were building 255, uh, that's thought to be on some kind of like a lunar observation kind of ritual shrine site, and they found two female figures there in like what they are calling like a small temple. And in situations like that, it wasn't for a big open audience. It was kind of a private ritual in this case, women's rituals. There are women probably specifically, again, the thought is maybe they're making these artifacts themselves. There was a woman artist making some of the female figurines. Um, but also when they're telling that story, they're doing it in a more private and secluded place. But those are special kind of storytelling events. The most common storytelling that would have been done at a family level would just be in a family's house, typically on a winter evening. In Native American storytelling, there's oftentimes taboo about telling stories out of season. It depends about the type of story, but most of the stories would have been told in the winter. Which makes sense because, in the summer you got work to do, long days, you're going to be outside working. But in the winter, it gets dark so early and we're stay inside and stay warm. What else are we going to do? But the taboos in the summer might be that if you told a story out of season, the snakes are going to get you, or little people are going to get you. Okay. So the vast majority of stories that would have been told, I think, in a family setting like that. Grandpa or grandma telling the stories in winter night, sitting around the fire to the grandkids. Um, and that epic tale, for example, you wouldn't tell the whole story one night. It might take you a month to tell that story because every night you tell a different episode. Okay. And likewise with your stories about old woman who never dies, grandmother. Every night you tell a different story about her.
Hmm. Well, it sounds like a continuation of a long human tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah, those families sitting around swapping stories,
Yep.
sharing their history. Um, it's easy to imagine that happening anywhere in the world at any given point in time, really.
Yep.
So I think we could probably go on and on about this for a long time, but I kind of want to move us toward wrapping up. And Cahokia eventually depopulated. There's no obvious reason for it. There's no sign of, armed attacks or anything that wiped out the village. Uh, from my reading of it, and maybe this is the way you would think of it too, it seems like people just kind of gradually started moving away more than there was any one single event that triggered depopulation. So, in your mind, like from what you know, like what do you think explains that the end of this great settlement?
All right, imagine it all unraveling, okay? And we began with 8,900 warm wet period for great for growing corn. 8,1200 is a cold dry period, not so great for growing corn. And they've been growing corn now for several centuries without beans. Beans come later from Mexico. Okay, so there's the little problem with the sustainability of their agricultural system, possibly. They've possibly cut down lots of trees to plant their cornfields. All right. So, and also eating corn without beans is not as healthy as eating them together. So there are environmental problems not of human making. Like we call this that the cool dry period we call the Little Ice Age. It also affects, for example, Vikings moved to Greenland around 8900 during that warm period, and then they have to move out again in AD 1200 because it's too cold. So there are some larger global environmental changes, climate changes that are not caused by humans, but then there are localized environmental changes that Cahokians were unwittingly responsible for, growing corn without beans or cutting trees down. Imagine if you had 20,000 people living in the same spot and they all went deer hunting some weekend. So there are enough fish. You cannot, you could not eat all the fish in the lakes and the creeks and the river, but you could, I think, overhunt the deer. Okay. And you need deer not just for meat, but you need it for the hide. You need the bones for tools. You need the marrow. You need the antlers for tools. So everything in that deer, you need the sinew for binding your arrows. Everything in that deer is important for something. So there's all that stuff going on. And then, oh, and by the way, I should mention, after AD 1000, we see it's pretty common to see villages like like the Iroquois, for example, up in the Northeast. All their settlements typically after AD 1000 have palisades. They do have walls around them protecting themselves from each other. So I think that the population in general in the in the Eastern United States has grown by this point that there is competition for resources. At Cahokia, the only palisade that well, there was one at East St. Louis. And by the way, there is evidence of burning in East St. Louis around AD 1200 or something like that. So one thought is that maybe there was ritual burning, but maybe it was burned by an enemy. Okay. Cahokia itself, the wall goes up to protect the most sacred part of the site, the Grand Plaza, after AD 1200. Okay, so there could be some conflict and competition from other areas at that time. Okay, so you're correct. The population starts to decline. People had come to Cahokia and now they're leaving. And so some might be leaving because the food base isn't there. You can't feed people the way that you did. Also, the artifacts found look like earlier in Cahokia's history, even Joe Schmo Farmer got some of the exotic ritual materials coming out of Cahokia, the marine shell beads and the red flint clay pipes and things like that. But after AD 1200, it looks like those materials are restricted to the elites. So there's a change in how they're treating the non-elites, it would appear. Okay. And then we know that we're within the realm of the New Madrid Fault. Okay, so have you done a podcast yet on the New Madrid earthquakes?
I have.
I bet I knew you would have. Okay. So as you know, in 1811, 1812, it wasn't just one earthquake, it was a whole earthquake, series of earthquakes. And if you look at the USGS website, you can see the earthquakes happening down there all the time. They're just usually not big enough to talk about. But you know that the earthquakes of 1811, 1812 were felt for hundreds of miles. They were incredibly destructive. They didn't kill, the river going the wrong way. Thousands of acres of floodplain forest flattening, lakes disappearing, lakes appearing where none had been before. So just incredible. That would have destroyed the agricultural system, right? To have an earthquake
Hmm.
like that. Not that many people were killed in 1811, 1812 because there weren't that many people down in New Madrid, right? But uh, so imagine you're living at Cahokia and things have been going wrong. All right. And we know from the archaeological record that these earthquakes are happening. It's something like every 500 years plus or minus 200. Because as the earthquakes happen, these sand blows down the boot heel, sand goes shooting up in the air, and then boosh, they land back, the sand lands in the ground and it'll cover an archaeological site. And you can tell by the stage of that village underneath the sand layer when that earthquake went off. So we know that there are earthquakes happening around this time. And ultimately, it's not just Cahokia that's abandoned. It's a big area that archaeologists call the vacant quarter. And if you look at the area that's abandoned about this time, It suspiciously overlays with the area that felt the 1811, 1812 earthquakes. Okay. So Cahokia would have been on the periphery of it, but it would have felt it and it could have destroyed, like I said, destroyed their agricultural systems. Like, in the Boot Heel right now, or the Illinois side with the flooding that's been happening, as we go from drought to flood, because maybe we've messed up the environment again, but it's destroying the farm fields down there. When sand comes in and covers your good dirt, it's not good dirt anymore.
Right.
So, and we know they have to go distances to get trees from the kind of charcoal. They've cut all the trees down. Anyway, so all this, imagine all things could be going wrong. And here, if I believe in a world that's alive, and then this earthquake happens, I'm going to take that as my final sign, and I'm going to move on. All
Hmm.
right. And ultimately, if I bring it back to storytelling, the stories aren't working anymore. And the the story your grandma and grandpa tells you, you cling to that. But the story that Elite's telling you, I'm done with that. I'm just going to move on. So, the Osage believe that they are the descendants of Cahokians and the architects of Cahokia. They just move across the river, right? And they're in Missouri. But Cahokia was a multi-ethnic. Well, you talked about immigrants coming from far and away. And so I'm sure they may have identified as Cahokians, after generations, but they still have family in those other areas. So I'm sure as they leave, they go back to where they still have kin in other areas. So today, there are lots of Native Americans who look to Cahokia as an ancestral site, not just the Osage. And so they didn't just die, we commonly act like, oh, everybody disappeared, like they just all died or aliens came and sucked them up into a spaceship and took them away or something like that. No, they're the Native Americans who are still alive today,
Yeah,
who are
that's
many different tribes,
a
nations.
common misconception we have about places like this is just because that site is abandoned that the people must be gone as well. They're descendants of the Mayan civilization still living in Mexico and Central America
Absolutely.
today, very much so. And it seems like the people who lived in Cahokia spread out. There are traces of Mississippian culture throughout the Great Plains. There were big communities in the southeast,
Yep.
especially along the Mississippi River, on the Arkansas River, that were clearly Mississippian influenced. And then what the Natchez, as late as the 1720s, when the French were there, looked like they were probably direct descendants of Mississippian people as well. So they didn't
Right.
disappear. They just spread out and they moved on and they evolved and changed some over time, but some of those Mississippian cultural traits were still there.
Absolutely. The native tribes of the Southeast were still living what we consider a Mississippian lifestyle when Europeans showed up. And the Natchez are a good example. When I was in grad school, I was taught by a professor that they had all died out. Well, guess what? They didn't. There are people in the Chickasaw tribe today, Chickasaw Nation, who identify, I think they pronounce it Natchez, because I don't know, they're from the Southeast. But so there are still people who identify as Natchez in the Chickasaw tribe today. So they're not gone.
Right. So one of the things I know that's very different now in the field, it used to be you kind of hinted at this before that in archaeology and anthropology, Native American sites were basically treated as fair game for anybody to come in and dig and do whatever they want. And there's been tremendous pushback. So today, like, what's the relationship between a site like Cahokia and contemporary Native American communities?
Well, I'm going to say there's nothing that's going to be done in Cahokia without consulting with Native nations. Okay, so again, starting with the Osage, but there are a number of like the Peoria, there are a number of Native nations who would be consulting anytime anything is done at Cahokia. And by the way, I'm sure if your listeners are listening to this anytime soon, they're going to be asking, when is that interpretive center going to open up again? So today is March 12th, 2026. And the word on the street is it's supposed to open in April. I heard April 1st, but they may have pushed it back again, but it should be open very soon. So go see it. All the new displays that were done in there were done consulting with Native peoples. Okay. And so in terms of the displays in the museum, consultation and collaboration are essential. But also in terms of Will there be field work? I don't think there's going to be any digging anytime soon at Cahokia. Um, but even something like remote sensing where we're not digging, you just use equipment to get an idea of what's below ground. Even something like that is what we call non-invasive. Even something like that's not going to happen without consultation and collaboration with Native peoples to make sure that they approve. And if they don't, then it doesn't happen. It's not approved.
Is there is there any particular story that you have yourself about Cahokia, something that you learned about Cahokia that really struck a chord or resonated particularly strong with you?
I don't know. I guess I'm as I'm talking to you, you can see I'm sitting. It looks like I'm sitting in the dirt, and it's a picture of an excavation on our SAU campus. So I guess I would just end by saying, to me, the coolest thing. Let me say this: when people say, "What's the coolest thing you've ever found?" I will say two things. One, in a field school that we did 20 years ago, we found this grinding tool, a little mono for that presumably some woman used. It was in the plow zone, so we don't know if it was 1,000 years old or 6,000 years old, but it fit my hand perfectly. It was all smooth and polished. My thumb fit perfectly. My fingertips fit perfectly. Sorry, and I could just imagine some woman holding that in her hand and grinding corn 1,000 years ago, or hickory nuts 5,000 years ago, and taking care of her kids. So that to me, the human story. And my other favorite thing in the world to find, what you see sitting in this picture behind me, is a Mississippian house that we are excavating. And to me, finding a house, to the non-archaeologists, they're like, it's dirt. And they're like, it's not like, you see beautiful stone walls because they were living in thatch houses, but we see dark colored dirt where the house pit was, where the walls were. And so to me, that is the coolest thing, to sit there and think somebody slept here 1,000 years ago. Parents, children, a dog snuggled up to keep warm. So that to me is the coolest thing that brings it to life. The Kokians and the people before them were humans like we are, and they loved their kids, and that was their priority, was to raise those kids, feed them, and bring them up in their community in a good way. And in that sense, we hopefully have that in common with them.
Really, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and to share your expertise and to speculate a little bit as
You're
well.
welcome. My
Deeply
pleasure.
appreciative of it. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by Noah Fence. See you next time.